So last year I uploaded a review of Sonic Frontiers, saying that I quite liked the game and that the Sonic series was back. And while I still mostly agree with that review, I definitely left out some major issues with the game and was probably a little too positive. But my point in bringing this up is that the Sonic series now needs to show that it can keep delivering solid games and not do what they did after Sonic Generations. So that brings us to the first major Sonic game after Frontiers, Sonic Superstars. So this game is basically supposed to be a return to the classic games, even though we already did that with Mania. But what's different about this game is that instead of being a celebration of classic Sonic games like Mania was, with all of the returning stages and ideas, this game is trying to be its own thing, which I really like the sound of. But the question is, does the game deliver? Is this game truly the next step for classic Sonic? So for starters, how does the game feel? Classic Sonic physics are always something Sonic Team, the people who made the classic Sonic games, seem to have a lot of trouble with. With Sonic Generations, Sonic Forces, and Sonic Origins in particular, there was always some sort of problem with the physics, whether it be small or not small. But in this game, I'm actually pretty happy to say that everything feels pretty good. Another thing I would like to compliment the game on before we get into some of the larger things is the visuals. This game doesn't look groundbreaking or anything, but for what it is, I think it pulls off the art style it is going for pretty well. But for me, a lot of this stuff doesn't really matter unless the levels themselves are actually, fun. To be completely honest, I have been a little worried about this game ever since hearing that it was being developed partly by Arzest. These guys were responsible for some not great stuff in the past, and it had me worried that they were basically going to mess everything up here. But to my surprise, the levels are, for the most part, pretty good. The main one that stands out to me is Speed Jungle Act 1. It's got a really simple gimmick with these vine grind rail things, and they're just really fun. Cyber Station isn't one that I necessarily remember having the greatest level design out there, but a lot of its gimmicks were pretty fun and memorable, so it gets a pass in my book. The only stage I can think of that I really didn't enjoy that much was Golden Capital. Its whole gimmick was gravity, but it didn't even really use it that much or in an interesting way. It also brings back some of the pinball gimmicks, but there's already an entire zone dedicated to pinball stuff, and it does it way better. This stage is also probably the most bland looking one to me as well. It's just a bunch of walls that all look the same. But honestly, other than this zone, I feel the rest of the zones and acts do a fairly good job of looking and feeling memorable. Recent Sonic games have shown a pattern of just reusing the same level elements and gimmicks over and over again. So I was a little worried that this game would start to feel pretty repetitive pretty fast, but the game ended up pulling through as almost every zone in the game had new gimmicks, most of which don't get reused, which allows each stage to feel pretty unique. We have the ones I talked about already, but we also have some other cool ones like Sandopolis, which has a big old snake that you run on in certain parts of the level. There is Pinball Carnival, which starts as a pretty standard Sonic pinball level, but then by the second act it gets a Halloween theme on top of it, which I thought was pretty fun. The level also has these cool roller coaster sections, which give a pretty cool sense of speed. There were some level sections that I thought were a little too slow, but for the most part you were actually doing something instead of just sitting around and waiting. I could go on about all the different level gimmicks and themes, but sadly the game does have some issues we need to talk about. So almost every level in the game ends with a boss, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sonic Mania had bosses after the end of every act. But the problem is that these bosses aren't like the bosses in Mania or any other classic Sonic game really. These bosses are clearly designed to work better for multiplayer, which was a big part of the game. You can't just hit a boss over and over again like you can in the other classic Sonic games. There are clear points where you are and aren't allowed to hit them. This can cause boss fights to drag on for way longer than they need to be, and since these bosses are attached to the levels, I honestly think it ruins the pace of some of them. There are some stages where it felt like it took just as long to beat the boss as it took for me to get to it. Now I get why they did this. If you were playing 4 players and everyone could just hit it over and over again, it would make the bosses way too easy. But the way it is now just makes it not very fun if you were playing single player. The only way I could think to fix this is just to deal with the fact that the bosses will be easy in multiplayer, or they could at least make the bosses separate from the stages and have less of them. Some particular examples of how bad these bosses can get is the Fang boss in Golden Capital, making that zone even worse worse than it already is, and the final boss for the main story. These fights take forever to complete, and a few slip-ups send you right back to the beginning. It just really sucks because for the most part the stages are fine, but the bosses just really bring them down. Another big thing in this game is the other playable characters. This is a pretty standard classic Sonic thing, as there have been other playable characters in the game since Sonic 2. We of course have Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles playable, who all play pretty much identical to how they did in Mania. Amy is also playable in this game after being introduced in the Origins DLC. She plays a lot like Sonic, except for a few differences like the fact that she has a double jump. All of these characters are pretty fun to play as, but I think Sonic, like usual, is my favorite to play as. Also, after beating the main game, you unlock this new character called Trip, who has a double jump as well as being able to climb walls. She's a pretty fun character to play as, which makes it a pretty cool bonus for beating the game. Speaking of beating the game, one of the main things that will assist you in completing that goal is the Chaos Emeralds. Much like the other classic Sonic games, to obtain these you need to complete special stages. To get to these, all you have to do is enter one of these big rings and you will be transported to some of the worst swinging mechanics ever put on my TV. So these special stages mostly just consist of you swinging on these floating orbs to reach the Chaos Emerald. The problem is that the game doesn't really want you to do that. I don't hate the idea of these special stages, but with how inconsistent the lock-on is, it can be incredibly annoying to finish them. I feel like half the time whatever I want to swing off of is just like right in front of me, and the game just decides that it would rather me not use that one. I was eventually able to get used to them, but I still didn't really find them all that fun. But you don't go unrewarded for completing these. The Chaos Emeralds no longer just allow you to unlock Super Sonic, but instead each emerald gives you a different power which you can use during your playthrough. To be completely honest, half the time I forgot I even had these. The game never really encourages you to use them except for a few certain areas, but most of the time the reward for doing so isn't that great. Honestly, the one I found the most useful in the levels is the water ability, but it's really only useful in one zone since there's only one water-themed zone. It kinda sucks because I think some of these abilities have cool ideas behind them, but they just aren't implemented the greatest. So overall, Sonic Superstars is a somewhat flawed but overall fun classic Sonic experience, is what I would say if there weren't some other factors here. Now look, I'm not usually one to say that a game isn't worth whatever price it is. Most of the time that is an aspect that I leave out when talking about games, mostly because the games I'm talking about aren't usually new releases, but you get the point. But this game costing $60 just isn't quite right. Sonic Mania on launch day was $20, and that game honestly offers around the same amount of content as this game, but let's be honest, it's higher quality content as well. Also, with how old Mania is at this point, the game goes on sale for like $5 pretty consistently. While I couldn't necessarily point out any major problems with Superstars, I was also having problems pointing out major positives, which would be fine if this was a budget title like Mania was, but the game decided to go full price, and I think that a lot of people are going to think less of it because of that. And to add insult to injury, the game was released 3 days before Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Now this game, holy crap, this game has brand new ideas in every single level I've played, and I've barely scratched the surface on everything this game has to offer. Sonic Superstars, on the other hand, was a fine experience that I have no real desire to play that often. I do like Sonic Superstars, but it does concern me that we might just keep getting more and more half-baked Sonic releases. Both Sonic Superstars and Sonic Frontiers are games that I like, but both of them also feel like they could be much better. These games give me hope that the team is trying, but also show me that they either aren't allowed or aren't willing to fully deliver on a product. Once again, I enjoyed this game, but I think me and a lot of other people expect better if you're going to charge full price right next to two of the best games of the year. Actually, wait. This game has Lego Sonic in it, and if I pay $5 more, I can play as Lego Knuckles. Yeah, I take it back. This is the greatest game ever made.